Breaking news. Randy Pitchford posted controversial comments on the internet. When someone on X Twitter asked if the upcoming Borderlands 4 would have an $80 price tag, a good question considering how Nintendo and Microsoft have both acknowledged their plans to raise prices for software and even hardware, as well as several third-party publishers potentially following suit in regards to their software output. Randy Pitchford, the head of Gearbox Entertainment, which is a subsidiary of Take-Two Interactive and the parent company of Gearbox Software, which is Borderlands 4's developer, which, wow, corporate structures can be so goddamn convoluted, responded to this innocuous question with the most inflammatory statement possible, as only Randy Pitchford can. Say what you will about him, he's f***ing consistent. To quote, A, the cost of Borderlands 4 is not my call. B, if you are a real fan, you'll find a way to make it happen. My local game store had Starflight for Sega Genesis for $80 in 1991 when I was just out of high school working minimum wage at an ice cream parlor in Pismo Beach, and I found a way to make it happen. End quote. Now, before I go any further, it is very much worth noting that Pitchford eventually addressed the controversy in a post on X Twitter and did so with a more conciliatory tone. I would not necessarily refer to it as an apology, and more of just a clarification of details describing a misunderstanding and an acknowledgement that saying, if you're a real fan, you'll find a way to make it happen, had terrible optics. To quote the front portion of that statement, link in the description, I am sorry there was a misunderstanding. The absolute sincere truth is that I don't want anyone to pay any more than they should or are comfortable with, and I always work with the intent and hope that a customer always feels they got the better end of the deal no matter what they pay. The actual context was that a guy replied to a post about Borderlands 4 on the Nintendo Switch 2 was warning me that if the price ends up being $80, the game will fail. What I was trying to do was explain that it wasn't my call, but that if a $10 price increase does happen, since that's obviously where the industry is going, it will be okay, and that Borderlands 4 will be okay because it's a good game and there are a lot of fans who will see the value and want it. I think my trying to shorthand that using the phrase real fans triggered some people, and I saw that it got inflated as if I was making some big statement. I wasn't, I was just trying to help someone who I thought was sincerely worried about us and looking out for us. And I could see that I was being pressed into the idea that I was taking the audience for granted, which is a super shitty look, but it was not at all my intent and does not reflect at all how I feel. End quote. Now, is Pitchford sincere, or is he just playing PR given his past track record of less than savory statements and alleged behavior over the years? Who knows? I'm not going to speculate on that because that's between him and looter shooter Jesus. But what I will say is that his original post and his eventual follow-up explanation that reframed his original point with more compassionate language towards potential Borderlands 4 customers highlights an economic disconnect between game company executives and their customers, the one where very wealthy game company CEOs, presidents, and other executives maintain certain beliefs about money that comes across as out of touch and insular compared to that of the common person. Because it's incredibly easy for a gaming executive to believe that a $10 price increase is minuscule given that their salaries are in the 6, 7, and even 8-digit range. Which, if that describes you, then congratulations, you won the game known as life. But for the rest of us who are on a much lower economic tier, increasing the cost for video game software by $10 isn't as easy for us to swallow. If anything, the game industry is attempting to spoon-feed us all cauliflower, which, as we all know, is a shit vegetable. And this new price increase is especially difficult to stomach, considering that the retail cost for video games already jumped from $60 all the way up to $70 roughly 5 years ago at the beginning of the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and S console cycle, which was controversial back then. But now in 2025, many companies have announced or are preparing to announce an $80 price tag for their games, and aside from Nintendo with Mario Kart World launching with the Switch 2, the rest of these companies aren't even bothering with the "it's a whole new console generation" YOLO excuse that industry-wide price increases generally coincide with, especially considering that Microsoft has a macro hard-on in regards to its plans to inflate the girthy monetary cost of its first-party software from $70 to $80 by the start of holiday season 2025, as well as how the company upped the price for the Xbox Series X, its current generation video video game console to $600 earlier in May, which is astounding considering that a mere 5 years ago, the Xbox Series X launched for $500. And that's even before we dive into how price for Xbox controllers and accessories have also increased as well. It's not the best look for the gaming business, to be completely honest with y'all. However, the AAA gaming industry isn't entirely in unison with each other in terms of selling games and even hardware at a higher monetary cost at retail. In fact, some publishers are approaching the pricing of their games on a case-by-case basis, only increase prices in certain territories, or in the case of Electronic Arts, ignoring this trend entirely and sticking with their current pricing stratagem, which, wow, Electronic Arts busting a nut with the rare W. I didn't know they had any juice left in them. But with that being said, raising game prices remains the industry trend more so than not, which is overall a major mistake by the games industry, and one that unfortunately reflects some earlier mentioned insular beliefs among game industry executives. And yes, I know that many companies attempted to justify their decisions by describing the volatile economic environment we currently reside in. For example, Xbox lamented the buck being passed to the customer, stating, "We understand that these changes are challenging, and they were made with careful consideration given market conditions and the rising cost of development. Looking ahead, we continue to focus on offering more ways to play more games across any screen and ensuring value for Xbox players." End quote. But here is the thing. Sure, development costs have gone up, but that is also, courtesy of the game industry, partially a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the dick balls. After all, this industry's obsession with massive AAA games with bloated budgets, high technical performance, and 5-year development times, all while neglecting smaller scale games with minimal and middling budgets, have essentially placed the AAA game industry in a bind as they all try to outcompete each other, as well as placing certain expectations on the customer to where these lavish productions are standard operating procedure rather than not, which is not in the hemisphere of good. Mostly because game companies made a rookie mistake. Never ever give gamers expectations, especially if there are doubts that you cannot fulfill them. I'd say Peter Molyneux had to learn that lesson the hard way many times, but honestly, I don't believe he ever did learn that lesson to begin with. In other words, in regards to game performance and budgeting, the AAA industry inception beliefs about how a big budget game is supposed to play, look, or be designed into the minds of gamers, and now many gamers expect all AAA games to feature adjacent sorts of production value. Furthermore, AAA titles are generally live service games or games with live service elements, meaning that beyond purchasing the games, companies have other avenues, albeit often to the detriment of the games themselves, to accrue revenue from these titles like microtransactions, DLC, loot boxes, season passes, and etc. In other words, selling a given game alone just often isn't the end of the potential money to be raked in by these corpos. So given that, when companies whine about how video game development is too expensive, even with all the potential ways to potentially turn a profit, I don't really have much sympathy here. If anything, I question whether or not they're in the correct business of doing business. I'm just all out of exquisite to give. However, there is one aspect regarding price increases that I don't really fault publishers for, of which of course I'm talking about inflation, no relation. Though as a quick aside, allow me to make a message to my friendly international viewers. Please forgive me for how this next section is very American-centric, given that my country's income inequality between the top and the rest of us is as absolutely appalling as it is unconscionable. Team USA for the win! But anyway, the point. As many of us know, a lot of things are more expensive in America these days, something that was happening even before the pandemic lockdown, but it was undoubtedly kicked into another gear via that said pandemic lockdown. If anything, most things cost more money than they used to, so on paper it makes sense that video game prices would adjust to match that, especially considering that, once again on paper, wage increases in the US have outpaced inflation. But still, with that said, the numbers here don't tell the whole story. The numbers are just averages, and there are a lot of elements that don't paint the entire picture. For example, the rate of people renting in the US has grown 3 times faster than that of people owning homes, which is a problem regarding both inflation and income inequality, given that between 2019 and 2023, the cost of rent in the US has increased 30.4% versus wage gains, which sit at a 20.2%. And once again, I know that the pandemic lockdown influenced those numbers, but that doesn't change the fact that the amount of renters are both increasing and are feeling the pain monetarily. Additionally, food prices have also increased 24% since 2020. And for younger people, college tuition is always going up, because at this rate, if you're a millennial or younger, good luck having a stable and rewarding career or owning a home. That shit now belongs in the fantasy section. In other words, people have other more important things to spend their money on, things that factor into the category of needs rather than wants. And unfortunately for the game industry, video games qualify as wants. Sure, entertainment and media is good for the soul, and thus even people economically struggling will still buy a game, movie, book, or such every now and then, but they won't do it as often as they otherwise would if they had more cash to spend, meaning that many customers will spend on games that maximize their value or pique their interest the most. For reference, I see an $80 price tag working for Grand Theft Auto or adjacent sorts of titles that are like big deals, but something like, say, Borderlands 4, I honestly believe an $80 price tag will hinder it more than help. Not enough to where it will cause the title to flop, but enough to where the price prevents the game from being as successful as it otherwise could and should be, because in today's economic environment, $80 for a video game is a very steep cost.